Welcome to episode 28 of Behind Our Science. I'm your co-host Daisy Shu, alongside my brilliant co-hosts Roberto Moda and Vic Meadows. Today, we're diving into the recent NIH budget changes for 2025, a time of cuts and mounting uncertainty that has left the research community both worried and on edge. In this episode, we've got a three-part lineup to keep you informed and engaged. First up, we're chatting with Dr. William Coleman, Executive Officer of the American Society for Investigative Pathology, a proud sponsor of our podcast. He will share his insights on how these budget shifts are reshaping the overall research landscape, the implications this has for future and early career researchers, and finally, the role of diversity in this evolving picture. Next, we turn to UNC Chapel Hill Grants Administrator Dani Burns, who will demystify the concept of indirect costs, now capped at 15%, and explain how this change is impacting research institutions. And finally, we'll hear from Vic Meadows on Capitol Hill Day, as we join forces with fellow scientists and advocates to urge our lawmakers to provide sustainable, predictable federal funding for scientific research. So whether you're a researcher, policymaker, or just curious about how government funding shapes the future of science, stay tuned. Let's get behind our science and into the heart of these pressing issues. Welcome to another episode of Behind Our Science. Today, we're thrilled to have a very special guest, Dr. William Coleman, the Executive Officer of the American Society for Investigative Pathology, or ASIP or ASIP, as we've discussed in our podcast previously. Dr. Coleman is a true trailblazer in molecular pathology and translational medicine, starting his journey with his undergraduate studies in Wingate College and a PhD in biochemistry from Wake Forest University. Dr. Coleman quickly made his mark and his groundbreaking research at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine, where he focused on liver stem cells cancer biology and the molecular subclassification of breast cancers, has paved the way for innovative treatments and a deeper understanding of disease. With over 140 research publications, 11 influential books to his name, and not to mention his extensive role in mentoring the next generation of scientists, Dr. Coleman has consistently pushed the boundaries of what we know about human pathobiology. His leadership in various high-impact research programs and committees has not only transformed his field, but also set the stage for the future of medical research. In today's episode, we will dive into a very pertinent topic, exploring the new NIH budget cuts, which I'm sure a lot of you are concerned about, and the evolving DEI policies. And we're asking him all about these questions, the shifts, how they're set to impact the landscape of research in the USA and beyond. So get ready for a very engaging conversation filled with lots of insights and challenges, and let's take a glimpse into the future of science. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. William Coleman. Yay.
Yay, so exciting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll kick off today's interview with a question to just highlight the key changes in the NIH budget to let our listeners know what the changes have been and explain why these shifts are happening.
Sure. Sure, Daisy. Thanks. Thanks to you and Vic and Roberto for inviting me to come. It's a real pleasure to be here on your podcast. So the current administration, the new administration, has targeted cutting the budget in lots of different ways and touching all aspects of the federal government. And so, as you might expect, the NIH has a considerable budget. Of course, it's not the biggest part of the federal budget. It actually is a fairly small amount of the federal budget, about 1%. But nevertheless, it's been targeted for cuts that we've seen already since January the 20th, which include freezes to funding, existing funding, changes to the overhead, the facilities and administration rates, as well as a pausing or a slowdown of processing of current grant applications, and elimination of some grant applications that fall under diversity, program announcements. And so there's a lot of things happening. A lot of these things are being litigated in court, and many of them will probably be determined to be illegal, given the way the laws are written, which will be good. In most cases, we've got temporary court orders to halt the implementation of some of these executive orders that came out of the president's office. But we can expect that the NIH budget is going to continue to be targeted by the Trump administration and by Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency. Unfortunately, of course, as we've all seen reported in the news, it's not waste just because you don't agree with what it's being spent for, and it's not corruption just because you don't understand what's being done. And so their drive to eliminate waste and corruption and those sorts of things don't necessarily translate directly over to the NIH, but the NIH is still going to be affected by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very unfortunate that there's a misunderstanding about the importance of scientific research, and certainly not waste when those dollars are going towards really great research. And oftentimes we're stretching that budget, even with the money we're getting, we're making the most of it. So they're really getting a lot of bang for their buck with the NIH. Every time they fund a researcher, we are really trying to do our best to make that money turn into a lot of innovation. I'm wondering if you could speak about what the immediate challenges are for the research, for the US researchers and professional societies that might be a result of these changes in the immediate instance.
Yeah, so there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of institutions have become very cautious because of the uncertainty. And so we've seen lots of things reported. Most recently, we've seen reports that graduate schools are pausing their admissions process for new graduate students for the fall of 2025. That will no doubt, affect the pipeline of researchers down the road, particularly if we kind of lose this class, or if we lose this class and the next and the next and the next. And then, of course, early career researchers, people that are just starting out, are very vulnerable because they're trying to get funded, they're trying to get started up, they're trying to become productive so that they can be established and then have a sense of security with respect to their research funding and their research program that they're trying to implement at their institution. And so I think that those are two of the really big ones that we worry about is the pipeline of researchers, both at the graduate student level, but also affecting those people that are at the intermediate stage as a postdoc or transitioning into an early career investigator. And of course, a lot of these things that are going on at the NIH are likely to touch everybody, even the most senior researchers, the most established researchers, the people with the most money. So I think nobody's going to be spared here. The anti-DEI stance that the administration has taken has been particularly disturbing, and I think that it's going to have a number of different impacts that we're going to recognize fairly shortly. The one that we've become immediately concerned about are things like training grants, where for 50 or 60 years, people have written training grants and have included a very strong plan for recruitment of a diverse student body to be trained. And it's not clear if the NIH will simply rewrite the guidelines for a T32, for instance, to say you don't have to do that anymore. Or if the institutions that hold these T32 training grants now will actually be penalized by virtue of the fact that they conform to the requirements under which the grants were written and funded. In addition to that, we've heard about certain diversity categories of grants being administratively withdrawn. And I think everybody has to recognize that any grant application that goes to the NIH is reviewed for merit. And in the case of the diversity categories of the fellowship grants, they are simply drawing from a different pot of money. They're still scored for merit. You still have to be meritorious to get funded. You're simply being considered with a different pool of researchers. And something much better could have been done than just administratively withdrawing those grants. Those grants could have just been rolled over and considered with the larger pool. And without a doubt, many of them would have still been funded just through a slightly different mechanism. So some of these things feel a little bit indiscriminate. And of course, we've worked hard, on our diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, kind of things in our society. And we certainly don't want to lose, the gains that have been made over the years.
No, I think that's an incredible point, Bill, and I think it's something that's in everyone's mind nowadays. As someone that was funded at some point, and I mean, by a diversity supplement, that actually boosted my career because that was something that I gained when I gained my green card. It's been something that actually catapulted into my new position. But I wanted to just point out that a lot of these initiatives and things that are happening with the NIH, a lot of the societies and specifically ASIP have been incredibly active on doing a lot of the not mediation, but advocating for these to be remediated. And one of the things that I wanted to assess is because one of the things that we've been interested in doing here in the podcast is we highlight people from all spectrums, right? So industry, non-industry, academic, all we've done Black History Month, Hispanic, so all of them throughout the spectrum because we're trying to be fair to all different people in science, right? But when we're thinking about certain areas, research areas that might be more affected than others, do you think there might be one that the proposed budgets actually might target?
That's an excellent question. I think that that brings us to our new HHS Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And RFK Jr. has some very hard stances on various aspects of health and biomedical type things. I think everybody is aware of the fact that he's a vaccine skeptic and that he's promoted some of these anti-vax kind of movements and whatnot, as well as other things. He has stated that he wants to emphasize chronic disease, which is great. What his wanting to emphasize that points out, illuminates, is the fact that he doesn't appreciate the fact that we already study chronic diseases quite extensively. Cancer is a chronic disease, diabetes is a chronic disease, heart disease is a chronic disease, just to use a few examples. And infectious disease research is very important, and that's the one that he has called out specifically to say we're going to pause our research into infectious diseases. And he used the time frame 8 years. I don't know where that came from. And so I think that we don't know the answer to the question. Are there going to be certain areas that are going to be hit the hardest? I think that the two factors that play in here are that RFK Jr. is quite likely to dabble in priorities for research funding at the NIH, and he's going to want to push the money towards the things that he's most interested in. And in the past, the priorities for the individual institutes were mostly determined by the institutes themselves. And that's not to say that the HHS secretary didn't play a role, but they let the institutes, really determine where the emphasis should be. The other one that I'm really concerned about are orphan diseases, because I think that when you've got somebody like Elon Musk looking at things, strictly speaking, from a financial cost-benefit perspective, we all know that orphan diseases require a lot of money to research, just like common diseases, but they affect far fewer people. And we should not, of course, discard those patients and just say we don't care about this anymore. We should still research those things, but I would anticipate that if the Department of Government Efficiency gets their hands on some of the purse strings that lead directly to the research, that it's likely that some of the orphan diseases will also be sacrificed for the sake of saving money.
And
Yeah,
for
I
the
think that's
sake of
one.
I'm sorry, real quick, Dr. Coleman, would you mind explaining what orphan diseases are for maybe some listeners who don't
Yeah, sure,
often use
sure.
that term?
That was going to be my question. So thank you.
Yeah. So we're accustomed to talking about diseases that affect lots and lots of people, things like heart disease or cancer, where you've got hundreds of thousands of people in the United States or across the world that are affected every year. Even rare forms of cancer can still affect, tens of thousands of people each year. Orphan diseases tend to be those things that affect far fewer people. And so a good example would be some of the rare genetic disorders where maybe there's 40 or 50 cases in the whole world at any given time. I don't have off the top of my head the actual definition for the cutoff for an orphan disease, like how many cases there needs to be for it to be considered orphan. There is a definition of that, because some of the funding priorities in the past for drug development have been aimed towards orphan diseases. And so therefore it's been advantageous to some of the drug makers to get the designation of an orphan disease. But it is a relatively smaller number of people that are affected by those diseases on any given year. Doesn't mean that they're not serious diseases, doesn't mean that they're not life-threatening or life-shortening, because they are. They
And
just don't tend to affect as many people.
at some point, every disease is small, right? I mean, when we start and we actually diagnose a disease, it's really unlikely that we'll find as many patients as later on. And many of the pandemics have started as some of these like smaller diseases. So thank you for that, Bill.
Sure.
And it's true that no matter how rare a disease is, it doesn't mean that it has less value than perhaps something that does affect more people. So you spoke on how these cuts could impact U.S. institutions and the NIH institutions, especially if their direction of research focus get changed. But how could these budget cuts that are proposed and are being implemented now could impact long-term scientific innovation?
Well, I think anytime you take money, out of the pool, you're going to potentially stifle innovation and discovery and advances, simply because people will not be able to do the work that's necessary for those advances and that innovation to take place. Because innovation comes from creative people trying things, and to try things requires money. So I think that it's, on the one hand, we might look at the current crisis and say, well, it's only for a couple of years, but the ripple effect will be dramatic. I mean, I think it will put us behind some other big players in the world. It will put us behind Europe. It will put us behind China, other countries where there's a lot of emphasis on putting money into research, because they're wanting to drive that innovation and discovery. So I think it's going to be damaging. We worked during the course of my career. The NIH budget has gone up, up, up. There's more money there now than there has ever been, but it's harder than ever to get, because there's more research going on, there's more research being done, there's more applications being filed. And so we can't really spare, we don't need to dampen the momentum that's being carried forward. I think that it's going to be very difficult to measure in some regards, because most of it will be at the level of the individual laboratory. If it's your lab or my lab or somebody else's lab, what's going to happen there? Because we've all seen when people have funding droughts, when they lose funding for a period of time, it necessarily slows down their productivity, makes it harder to get that money back. And so that's just going to take place at a huge scale. some of the more recent firings that have taken place at the NIH of the staff scientists that work there is going to affect the intramural program at the NIH as well. And so that's also bad because the indiscriminate nature of the firings have been such that you don't know really what piece of the machine you're removing. And so, there's going to have to be a scramble for them to reorientate and move their workforce around to cover all the things that they were doing before. But of course, they won't be able to do all the things that they were doing before because they have less people to do it with. So I think there's going to be myriad, adverse effects from any sort of pause that takes effect for any length of time.
Yeah, I think that sentiment is shared universally with researchers.
Yeah.
What strategies are universities and research institutions adopting to navigate the impact of reduced NIH funding?
Yeah, well, so once again, I think that there's a lot of unknowns here. We don't know what's going to stick and what's not. What will pass and what will remain the same as we expect it to be now. The calculation that you have to do is this: for every dollar of research funding that comes into an institution, the multiplier for the local economic stimulation is about 2.5 or 3. So for every $1 billion that comes to, any given state, like the state of North Carolina, we get, 2.5 or $3 billion worth of stimulus that takes place just from the support structure around all of that research taking place. So when you begin to cut overhead, and you begin to cut actual dollars, both of those will have an effect on that support structure. Unfortunately, we're starting to hear about some really draconian measures that are being implemented in places. It was reported recently that one of the institutions out west has now dictated to their faculty members that they will no longer be applying for grants from the NIH. And this was in response to the 15% overhead. For every dollar of direct costs that go into a research program, you need approximately $1 worth of overhead, indirect cost, to support that research endeavor. At the big research institutions, some of them are getting 50 or 60% overhead, which means for every dollar, they're getting 50 cents or 60 cents to support the overhead. But they're also pitching in the other 50 cents or so that it takes, to do it. And so these institutions are simply saying, we can't make a commitment to support your NIH funded research program if they're only going to give us 15 cents on the dollar to support the overhead. So I think that's a really apocalypse now kind of scenario. And it mirrors the situation with the pausing of graduate student admissions. What it suggests is in the short run, there's going to be a real pullback on the part of the institutions because, the institutions do have, they do have money. They have money and endowments and things, some of which is accessible, some of which could be used for some of this, but they can't sustain that forever, is what the answer is. And so, given their inability to sustain that forever, they have to be careful about what kind of commitments they're making. Am I going to commit to providing 85 cents on the dollar for the next 5 years for some research program? Do we actually have that money to be able to devote to that?
Yeah.
And by necessity, the graduate students are somewhat sacrificial lambs of the workforce, which is really, really unfortunate as well.
Yeah. No, it does seem like it's just complicated and continues complicating as we think of it further. Is
Right.
there any role that the private sector partnerships or foundations or other philanthropic research contributions could impact this funding landscape? And could they maybe minimize the devastating loss of federal funding?
No. No is the answer to the second part of the question.
Got it.
I mean, I think that we're all researchers. We've all done this, right? So what we know is that researchers apply for everything that they're eligible for. I don't know anybody that ever rested on their laurels and said, yeah, I'm just going to go after that NIH money because I think that's all I need. When I was a researcher at the University of North Carolina, I had NIH funds. I had funds from private foundations, big and small. I had money that came from our cancer center on campus and other little intramural things that we could apply for. We applied for everything that we could because we never had enough money. It's like Daisy said earlier, you know, for whatever money we have, we stretch it as far as we can, and it's never enough. And so I'm not aware of anybody that has the good problem of having so much money that they aren't already pursuing these other things. Now, whether or not, you know, big funders like the Howard Hughes Medical Institute opens up new avenues of funding, that will be a question. Currently, they don't take, you know, unsolicited grant applications, but maybe they might start a program like that. There's a number of other, you know, big potential funders like the Gates Foundation, where they have previously been focused on certain disease types, and maybe they open it up and they decide that they want to fund some other stuff. And so there could be some pockets where there could be some things made up, but I think that for the general public, thinking that people are just too reliant upon the NIH and they're not already pursuing everything else that exists is sort of misinformation. It's just going to be a question of whether or not some of these private funders will have deep enough pockets to be able to make up for some substantial portion of whatever ultimately is lost. And currently we don't know what that's going to be.
Wow, it's ever evolving and so dynamic. And I'm sure that there will shift a lot of the grant funding mechanisms. And I hope these philanthropic foundations do step up and try to fill the void, at least in the interim, and help to keep that innovation, because the US is certainly known to be one of the biggest innovators in the world. And hopefully that global leadership in driving scientific innovation will remain. And hopefully we'll see what happens. And especially with that pipeline that you mentioned about the future generation, it's quite concerning because graduate students, they are so vital in terms of ensuring that, you know, they are the future of our scientific research. And we do need to promote that. So I'm really glad we spoke about all these things, and I'm sure there's a lot of our listeners out there, and also all of the ASIP members probably want to do something about this. So what can ASIP members and listeners out on our podcast do to effectively advocate for biomedical research funding?
Yeah. So, you know, so what we have been promoting, of course, is for our members to contact Congress, contact their senators and their representatives in the House. It's, you know, in the past, when we've advocated for certain things, you know, sometimes we would write to the NIH and we would say, hey, we think you guys should consider this, that, or the other thing. And of course, this is not an NIH problem as much as it is a problem of the executive branch. And what we need is for the Congress to push back on the executive branch and say, this is not a good idea. Now, the thing is that we sometimes will, you know, go down the rabbit hole of thinking that, you know, the senators and the members of the House want to save science. And some of them don't care that much about science. But what they do care about is the economies of their states and the jobs. And as we talked about, you know, with the economic stimulus that the grant funds provide and the jobs that are provided directly and indirectly, it becomes a big thing. And so this is where we think we can get the attention from the Senate and the members of the House. And so, you know, this is what lots of groups are advocating for. I'm seeing now that lots of institutions are encouraging their faculty members and their graduate students to reach out. Lots of nonprofit societies for scientists are encouraging people to reach out. we've been following primarily the lead of the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, FASAB, because they provide a lot of our advocacy, as a member organization, and they have good tools that we can take advantage of so that people can easily and quickly reach out and contact their members of Congress. So I think that that's what's going to be most effective. But in addition to people recognizing that the message needs to be not just about innovation and advancements of science, although those are important, and the downstream effects on patients and how patients will be treated in the future and whatnot, all of that's very important. But there also needs to be that message about the economic stimulus and the workforce, the jobs, so that gives the senators and the members of the House something to really, grab onto that's substantial and important for their state, for their district. So we want people to be reaching out, and we want them to continue to reach out. This is not one of those times when we can reach out once and we've solved the problem. We have to recognize that most of the court injunctions that are currently in place are temporary, and we're going to continue to need to put pressure on Congress so that they eventually put pressure on the executive branch. But as people reach out, they need to particularly reach out to the Republican members of Congress, because as we know from the partisan nature of our politics in this country, the Democrats losing their minds about this stuff is not going to get a lot of traction with the executive. But if the Republicans start to push back and say this is too far, too much, too quick, too bad of a process, whatever it is that they say, that could help. I think all of us would like to see, the government's money, which is taxpayers' money, well spent. And none of us want to see it wasted in any way, shape, or form. We certainly don't want, for corrupt practices to siphon away funds that could be used for something else. But I think that, our major criticism of what's going on is not the intent, but it's the way that they're actually doing it and the way that they're defining it. Because once again, I think that, just because you don't agree with the research program that's being funded doesn't mean it's waste. A lot of professionals evaluated that research program and said, this is important, and it merits investigation. And so therefore we should. And we should not let our non-science elected politicians, make those determinations.
Yeah, thanks, Bill.
Urging all our listeners out there, please reach out and please spread the word. And hopefully this podcast makes a difference there to our broader reach for the general public, educating you on all these recent changes in a zero jargon kind of manner, so that you can better understand how these impact research, and not only research, but economics and the workplace as well. So please reach out, and that will make a big difference.
Yep. And as a conclusion, Bill, I mean, I think we've gained a lot of knowledge from understanding a little more about the process. I have to say, like our stands, I mean, as the podcast has been more apolitical, trying not to base it off on politics. But of course, when something affects our daily lives, especially for scientists that are trying to improve life of others, it is a way that we need to advocate for what's right. And what's right is, in many of these instances, that means it has to be bipartisan. People have to put away whatever that is and understand, like, we wouldn't gotten this far without getting rid of the plague. We wouldn't gotten this far without penicillin. Like, we are here today because we've been able to battle diabetes, cancer, infections, all of these things, and that hadn't would not have been done without the proper research. And so that's where we're trying to advocate in this podcast. And with that in mind, I mean, I'm also, as part of, like you mentioned, a lot of different societies, right? It's ASAP, FASIB, HCS. I'm a council member for HCS. I'm a representative for HCS for FASIB, and I also represent a little bit of that for the podcast. And I've been thankful enough to be part of the Research and Science Policy Committee more recently. Now I understand all of this. This was going to be my third time going to Capitol Hill, but this would actually be the first time that we are having BIC. BIC is going to actually be representing HCS, so his chemical society, in the Capitol Hill, and that's a great way for people to get involved, because now you understand what that means. You actually get to talk about dollars and cents, like you said. A lot of these politicians, sometimes their interpretation of science is not the best, but when you get it to dollars and cents, that's when people start listening, right? So I think that'll be a great experience. I mean, we'll love to hear back from what Vic is going to be able to live through. But we'd like to close. Is there anything specific or else that you think might be important for people to know about this process that we've already haven't covered?
I think we've touched on most of it. Yeah,
Okay.
I think the last thing I would say is that historically, strong support for the NIH and research has been a bipartisan product of Congress. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that all the members of Congress recognize that their constituents get sick and that they need these discoveries, as well as them recognizing, the broader perspective of the economic stimulus and the jobs that are associated with the research workforce. So I think that yeah, in this particular case, we've got a Republican administration that's doing some things that we're not comfortable with, but generally speaking, in Congress, we get strong bipartisan support.
Yeah, and that's what we've learned from Capitol Hill. It's a lot of support for science. So we hope that that stays clear for the rest of the administration, but also because we've done it through COVID. The same administration relied on research. I was part of Active 4 at Pitt, and we were relying on innovation for vaccines and for anti-thrombotics, and so I think a lot of it is we have to be in communication and reach out and then keep at it. So I think that's great. We really thank you, Vic, Daisy, and you, Will, for this opportunity to discuss all of these new approaches to what has been a new change for the NIH. But we look forward to our a new avenue for research, and so hopefully that means a good thing for our future. So with that in mind, we'll like to close the episode. Thank you, Bill, for coming with us. Hopefully it's not the last time that you're in the podcast, and
Sure.
to everyone else in Behind Our Science, stay active and please participate. See you guys.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back to Behind Our Science. Today we're diving into something really murky in the world of research, which is indirect costs and grants. What they are, why they matter, and how they impact research funding is all really important, and we're excited to get to learn about that today. To help us navigate this topic, we're joined by Dani Burns, a powerhouse in grant administration at UNC. Dani is known for her deep expertise in the funding structures and her ability to break down complex grant policies, and most importantly, her energy and enthusiasm for making research dollars work smarter, which as researchers, myself, Daisy, and I are very excited about. Dani Burns has 10 years of experience in research administration in her current role in the clinical department as a clinical department administrator at UNC Chapel Hill. She's responsible for all financial, operational, and administrative functions, including oversight of all research expenditures and indirect cost allocations, which is very important because that's what we're talking about today. Dani has an MBA with a concentration in healthcare administration from UNC Wilmington, which is really cool. Congrats. And today we're going to talk about the roles indirect plays in supporting universities, the common misconceptions that we have around indirect costs, and the recent shifts in funding policies. Because as we know, Behind Our Science listeners and us as hosts, that science policy tends to have great impact in our research progress and success. Whether you're a seasoned researcher, a new faculty member, or just curious about what everybody's talking about and where grant money really goes, this episode will hopefully give you a behind the scenes look at the financial backbone of research. So Dani, welcome to Behind Our Science.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. It's exciting to have you. This is a topic that we've talked about in our little WhatsApp chat for Behind Our Science. And I've also spoken to it with a bunch of people in my like mentorship circle. And I recently learned that I didn't really know what indirects were, and the people who mentor me also didn't quite understand or grasp. And I'm glad that we have this opportunity to sort of explain it, not just to other researchers, but to people like my family who are not researchers, but this does eventually affect them because medicine and other breakthroughs all rely on the research that we do.
Absolutely.
So we're going to start with basics.
Cool.
What are indirect costs and why do they matter?
All right. Indirect costs are, as the name implies, costs that are not directly tied to a research project, but are still necessary for the research to be conducted successfully. These might also be referred to as facilities and administrative costs, F&A, or overhead expenses. And these indirect costs make up the support structure to manage and conduct research. And without them, research at universities would really not be possible.
That's a really interesting point because there's a lot of confusion between direct and indirect costs. Could you give us a breakdown of the difference between the two?
Certainly. The direct costs are expenses directly associated with the activities of the research project. These are your more visible costs, if you will. So let's say that we're conducting a study to assess the effectiveness of a new drug to treat cancer. Direct costs would include the time of the scientists involved in overseeing the study and evaluating the results, the time of the nurses involved in administering the drug and monitoring the study participants, and the time of the study coordinator to conduct informed consent and collect the data. Other direct expenses might include the cost of the drug itself and the supplies to administer the drug. But indirect costs, however, include the expenses necessary to conduct the research, but not directly involved in the study activities itself. So in the example I just gave, the indirect costs would include the compliance staff who are necessary to ensure all aspects of the study comply with all regulations, the accounting staff to ensure that the direct expenses are correctly applied to the right project, the HR staff to support the hiring and the appointment management activities of the faculty and the staff directly working on the project. And lastly, could also include the specialists involved in negotiating the terms and conditions of the various awards and also reporting back to those sponsors. And of course, there's also the space, the facilities, and the utilities required to actually house the research activities.
So it does seem like indirect costs are just as vital as direct costs to research.
Absolutely.
So how do these indirect costs get determined and who negotiates that rate?
Indirect cost rates are negotiated with the federal government and are renegotiated every 3 to 5 years. Indirect cost rates are negotiated separately by individual institutions, so it's not just one rate for all institutions. Every institution has their own rate. It's a very detailed and formulaic process, and that includes a space utilization assessment and a cost accounting of all the total indirect costs associated with the institution's functions, divided into facility costs and administrative costs. And actually, administrative costs are already capped at 26%, regardless of an institution's actual research admin expenses. So we've already been dealing with a cap of some kind this entire time. And there's been challenges even with that historically. So the review process is designed to ensure that what institutions receive in funding to support indirect expenses is accurate and appropriate. Once the rate is set, it's applied to the direct costs expended on each study. This is intentional to spread the collective costs of indirect activities proportionally to each project. And I'd also note that this rate structure allows for growth in research as research volumes grow. Let's say you're expanding from 500 million in research funding to $1 billion. So you're doubling your research volume. Your space is going to expand. Your ancillary staffing is also going to increase to help support that additional research volume. And an institution will need increased indirect budget in order to fund these functions.
Thank you, Dani. That was really enlightening, actually, because, yeah, I feel like I also didn't have a clear understanding of what indirect costs were. And yeah, no, it's just really informative. And I'm wondering about how we talked about it a little bit, but if you could expand upon how the indirect costs support a university's research infrastructure as a whole, and what some of those key expenses cover.
Sure. So as I mentioned previously, indirect costs include the facilities and research administrative costs that serve as the backbone to conduct research at universities. These include administrative staff to assist with accounting and financial support, facility management, research computing, regulatory compliance, faculty and staff appointment management, as well as the facilities themselves. So the actual utilities, the building repair, and the maintenance. So when you add all of those things up, it's not insignificant, and it is necessary to actually conduct the research.
Yeah, those are really vital and sort of just taken for granted, I feel like, in our day to day, where until something goes wrong, and then we definitely need them and realize how vital
Then
they
you're
are.
phoning your friends, and you really want to make sure
Yeah.
that
And research stops, and we're like, can someone please fix the flooding?
yeah, exactly.
And some researchers in the public think that these indirects take away from their actual project funding. How do you explain the importance of indirects to anyone against this?
I've experienced this when a sponsor gives a budget maximum that includes both direct and indirect costs, and researchers might be frustrated that a portion of that budget needs to be allocated to support indirect costs. I've always taken this as an opportunity to remind them of the true total cost of research and also the resources available to them to make their research possible, like the pre-award specialist who's helping them prepare that budget and that grant application, or the facilities manager who's down the hall right now repairing their autoclave and their laboratory. A good analogy that I like to use to stress the importance of indirect costs is owning a home. So there are direct costs associated with house ownership, like the house itself, the furniture inside the house, but you can't live in that house without running water, electricity, paying your property taxes. These indirect house costs make the home functional and not just four walls with no utility.
Yeah, no, that's a really great analogy.
That's an amazing analogy.
Yeah, no, I'm going to be using that one. Thank you, Dani.
Happy to help.
Are there other sort of common misconceptions about indirect costs that you'd like to clear up?
Absolutely. When you see news headlines about the billions of dollars tied up in indirect costs, it's easy to think without any prior knowledge, wow, that's a lot of money, and there's no way that it's being used effectively. But it's really critical to understand that these rates are not pulled out of thin air. As I explained earlier, it's a very rigid and very rigorous process. And as someone who directly oversees and manages a portion of the indirect cost recovery, I can confirm that those dollars are paying real wages for people in our community who are really critical to our research operations. Another point of clarification is that generally F&A rates are not a percentage of the total project cost, but rather the modified total direct cost to exclude direct expenses such as equipment, rent, tuition, subawards. And then lastly, I do also want to make clear that when we receive, let's say, an NIH grant, we don't actually receive all the money up front. Not all, but most federal grants are structured to be cost reimbursable, meaning that we first incur the expense at the university and then we request reimbursement on a periodic basis. This means that the indirect costs are also not awarded up front. And so at a very high level example, if I could give one, if an institution has a negotiated indirect rate of 50%, for every $1 spent in direct costs, 50 cents is then received to support the indirect expenses. And this practice really helps to ensure that we're only receiving indirect funding for the research activities that have actually been completed.
That's really interesting. That's actually, I have heard that breakdown of the 50 cents to $1 if it's a 50%, right? Which can be kind of confusing with the way that it's currently being talked about in media, which, we all get bombarded with social media and then the news. So I'm sure that it gets lost in the sauce, I guess. Have there been any significant changes in how indirect costs are handled at institutions like universities following the recent proposed cap? Because you did mention that if you have a 50% negotiated rate, which means that we've discussed this and we set it at 50, like how will that drop to 15 impact this theoretical institution?
Sure. So I will say that as of today, which is Tuesday, March 11th of 2025, which I still can't believe we're already halfway through March.
You and me, I
don't know how that happened. But as of today, the injunction still remains in effect against the mandates. So NIH projects are continuing to be funded and expensed with each institution's negotiated indirect cost rate. However, most in the research community do feel that a change in how indirects are funded and supported is coming, even if the 15% cap does not ultimately go into effect. I would also say that most institutions are really deep into planning and modeling financials to see, where they would stand, which projects might possibly be most at risk should the 15% cap become realized. I do also know, and this is scary stuff and real stuff, but there are some institutions that are under hiring freezes right now. There's certainly some that are considering layoffs for projects that have been impacted by other executive orders. So this is something I think most of us are in planning stages right now, but unsure right now really what those direct impacts are ultimately going to be.
Yeah. So this next question maybe like it's very similar to the previous one, but how would this impact or how would this cap affect academic research? Because you did say that we have some hiring freezes and we have some potential firings, but like what happens to research in academia if this goes into effect?
Yeah. The financial impacts are going to vary from institution to institution. Again, that depends on their current negotiated rate. So are they at 50% or are they at 20? That adjustment is going to be a little different depending on where you're currently at. It will also depend on their sponsored research portfolio, how much of their funding is coming from the NIH versus other sponsors, DoD, or nonprofits potentially. But to speak in general terms, a reduction to this critical funding to support the research infrastructure could very well result in delays of biomedical discovery and innovation. It's a real concern.
Yeah, as a biomedical researcher, I definitely feel concerned.
Yeah, if somebody's not concerned right now, then I have even more concern, I think.
How would federal versus private funders differ in their approach to indirects? Because I have also applied to foundational grants, and a lot of them have some subtext of no indirects are allowed. How would the switch to potentially being more foundational grant affect your approach to helping people resolve their grant issue?
Sure. So most federal sponsors are consistent in how indirects are funded by relying on that institutional, federally negotiated indirect cost rate that we talked about previously. And as you alluded to, private sponsors can vary pretty widely. Nonprofits may cap their indirects or not offer them at all because of their own limitations on their financial resources. I've noticed this more with smaller scale projects and more pilot-based research. It also really depends on the size of the nonprofit that you're engaging with. But ironically, these actually require more administrative resources than a standard NIH grant because typically this might be a sponsor we haven't worked with before or not as frequently. And so it's unique and new to the staff, and it just requires a lot more attention versus, pushing out a standard NIH R01. You know exactly what you need to do to get those grants out the door and how to manage them and the terms and conditions. So on the flip side, industry sponsors, at least in my experience, have been supportive of paying indirects. You might just need to be explicit in what these expenses include and use terminology that they're familiar with, such as loaded rates, which includes both the direct and indirect cost. But I have found the more upfront and transparent you are with them about what exactly you need, they're going to be more supportive and willing to pay those expenses.
So whenever a funder doesn't allow full indirect cost recovery, what happens? How does that affect a department or a university? And I know you just talked about how it affects with administrative effort, but is there any other effect beyond that?
Sure. I think that it can go a few different ways. The first would be that departments and universities either need to use alternate funding sources to cover those indirect costs. They're primarily fixed costs. So it's not like you choose to go with a different sponsor and all of a sudden overnight you no longer have those expenses. You still need to try and find a way to cover them typically. Another option is to possibly decline to work with certain sponsors. It's not ideal, but a reality depending on the financials of that particular institution. And a third option could be to actually reduce the available support. So that would then mean putting more burden on the researchers themselves to remain compliant, providing financial reports to the sponsors, essentially taking up the researcher's time with administrative functions and reducing the time available for that researcher to actually conduct their studies.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
there's a lot of
that's
burden of
wild.
administration. Yeah, so that's going to impact a researcher's productivity
Very
significantly.
much so. Very much so.
From an administrative perspective, what are the biggest challenges that you see in managing the indirects?
So these are very real dollars that have real impacts on individual labs, departments, centers, schools, universities, from the smallest of units to the largest. And some of the expenses directly supported by indirects in my department include salaries for pre-award and post-award staff, HR teammates, and facility staff. We also use indirects to support critical space renovations and purchase shared equipment that have benefits to multiple projects. And personally, as a steward of taxpayer dollars, I can confirm that every dollar I manage is spent appropriately. I take this role very seriously. I would say that my biggest challenge is balancing and prioritizing the needs of our department's research infrastructure, given that, frankly, even our current indirect allocation doesn't fully cover the costs that we feel are necessary to completely support our researchers.
Yeah, I definitely feel that we kind of stretch the money that we get in very resourceful ways. So we're doing really well to kind of maximize on whatever money we receive.
Yeah.
And how do you work with faculty to make sure they fully understand and account for the indirect costs when they're budgeting?
I'm really grateful. We've got a small but mighty team of subject matter experts. Talk about extending that dollar as much as you can. But we've got a team of subject matter experts that provide budgeting assistance to ensure that all the appropriate direct expenses are accounted for and the appropriate indirect rate is applied based on the sponsor guidelines. So they're right at the hip, working directly with our faculty to help educate them and make sure that the right expenses are included in that budget.
Nice. That's really good, having that dedicated support team for budgeting. Do you have any advice for researchers applying for grants when it comes to navigating indirects?
Some sponsors may not understand what indirect costs are, and that's not very surprising because it is a little bit opaque, I guess, based on at least the way that things are currently structured. And so, again, sponsors may not understand what those indirect costs are and how they're essential to fulfilling the proposed aims of the study. And so it's really important for researchers to advocate for including funds to support indirects in their budgets and really educating the broader community on the true cost of innovation.
Oh, yeah. So this is
A little heavy.
This is heavy
It's
stuff.
heavy topic.
Yeah, because I see the reason to educate the broader community, even just like general audience, right? Like we don't, there's so many things that I, as someone who's in the sauce, doesn't know. Imagine someone that hasn't ever stepped into a lab and held a pipette, right?
Absolutely.
So with shifts in research funding, do you see any trends on how indirect costs might be handled in the future? You kind of alluded to this earlier, but I'm hoping that we can kind of get your thoughts on it since you are so experienced in this.
Sure. I think many institutions right now are likely thinking about how to expand their funding portfolios to include nonprofits and industry sponsors. The NIH has historically been a very stable funding source for research at most medical schools, but given all these changes, I personally think it's risky to rely on the NIH to continue to support research at the levels that we're used to. I would also not be surprised to see other sponsors follow suit with whatever the NIH ultimately settles on. That's a trend that we've seen in the past. I do hope that that's not the case, but certainly something to think about.
If you could change one thing about the way that indirect costs are structured or perceived, what would it be?
I know I've been talking a little doom and gloom. I can see your faces as we're talking.
It's reality setting in. It's no big
It's
deal.
reality setting in, exactly. But it feels a little doom and gloom. But I think there's one positive thing that might be able to come out of this situation. I alluded to it earlier. There is very much an opportunity to make the true cost of research more transparent, to help educate our own researchers, our own staff, our communities, the public at large about, what indirect costs are and why they're so essential. And I really think that that's going to be critical to continue to be able to support research across our country.
That's very true. That's very well put. I agree. Transparency is great. Like we've been sort of moving that way in biomedical research with having publicly available data sets, not just depending on like you reaching out to the researcher and then that researcher answering your email. Because I've definitely reached out and they've been flat out ignored. So having these data sets, but unfortunately, these tend to be on NIH websites. Like a lot of the sequencing data sets that I get are NIH based. So I am a little worried, and I'm hoping that we can have some other public platform that isn't dependent on policy to have this sharing of data, because we as researchers only have so much time and so much expertise, maybe on one fraction of what our data shows us. So why not share it so that others that have different expertise can also use that data, and we can have a better understanding of whatever diseases or human health aspects that we're researching. So I agree. Transparency seems like a really good thing, and that there's hope out there, and hopefully we'll reach the hope sooner.
I am reassured. I think the research community is very strong, and so I'm pleased by the interaction I have with my colleagues across the country, and just the creative thinking, and really feeling so committed to this mission that no matter what, we're going to try and find a way to make this all work, and keep research going, and keep innovating, and keep making those discoveries.
That's very good. Thank you so much. Do you have anything else you want to ask, Stacey?
No, I'm good. That was fantastic. We covered so much.
Yeah, that was really well described. Thank you so much for being on Behind Our Science, Dani. I hope we can have you in the future.
Anytime.
If anything changes, we'll come back.
Yeah, you'll be our go-to person.
Bring it on. I love it.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
As a scientist and civilian grateful for the benefits of biomedical research, I was honored to represent the Histochemical Society during the 2025 Capitol Hill Day in Washington, D.C. On March 19, 2025, the societies that form the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, including our podcast sponsors ACIP and HCS, sent representatives to the nation's capitals to advocate for increased research funding for the advancement of biomedical research. As a lab rat myself, I'm not often given the opportunity to share the importance of my work with government representatives. This opportunity allowed me to implore our government officials to maintain federal research funds for organizations such as the NIH, NSF, VA, and DoD, which support life-saving and high-risk research, ensuring our nation remains a leader in biomedical research. If enacted, the Memorandum for Heads of Executive Departments and Agencies M2513, issued on January 27th by the White House Office of Management and Budget, will significantly impact the life-saving research and overall health of our nation. My fellow Pennsylvanians and I visited the offices of our senators and congressmen and had the vital opportunity to stand up for science. Are you interested in learning how federal research funds support research in your state or district? Visit the Science Policy and Advocacy resources at fasib.org to find out more. Again, if you're interested in learning what federal funds support research in your state or district, visit the Science Policy and Advocacy resources at faseb.org.
On behalf of Behind Our Science, we thank you for listening to episode 28, focusing on the federal research budget cuts, the cuts to indirect funds, and the overall changes to science policy. We know that if these changes are enacted, they will have far-reaching impacts on us as beneficiaries of the life-saving knowledge discovered through biomedical research. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and learned more about what the budget cuts to federal research funds means for you and your loved ones. I'm Vic Meadows. This was Behind Our Science, and as always, stay curious.